Hello, I'm Dr. Charlie Collins. Let's talk about research methods. Today, I'm going to talk about experimental designs. I will discuss what experiments are, the logic of experimentation, some basic experimental designs, and the process of conducting experiments. First, let me introduce our running example for this talk, the racially biased hiring studies conducted by Devra Pager, a Harvard sociologist. Dr. Pager was interested in examining potential racial disparities in hiring practices. So she created an experiment where members of her team went out with the same resume to apply for entry-level jobs in the same low-wage job market. All applications were identical, and all applicants were matched on interpersonal skills. The difference was that some of the applicants were black and some were white. In addition, some had indicated that they were recently released from prison for a nonviolent felony charge. So she had one white male, one black male, one white male with felony charge, and one black male also with a felony charge. What she found was astonishing. White applicants were called back twice as many times as black applicants. Even more disturbing was that black applicants with clean records were called back about as much as whites who indicated a nonviolent drug felony. Remember, the same application with the difference being race and a nonviolent felony conviction. Dr. Pager's study is a perfect example of a field experiment, which I will talk about in a minute. Experiments generally are studies in which researchers manipulate independent variables, such as a social situation, for example, to see whether the manipulation has any influence on outcome or dependent variables. In Dr. Pager's study, the independent variables were the applicant race and criminal record. The dependent variable was the number of callbacks. Experiments are very informative for social science research because we can control extraneous factors and isolate influences and the relationships among variables. In the social sciences, experiments allow the strongest case for causality compared to any other study design. This is because experiments allow us to identify three things: an association or relationship between two or more variables, the direction of that relationship between the variables, and an elimination of alternative explanations or other plausible factors of influence. You may be asking, how does an experiment allow us to identify these three things? It's because of random assignment or random sampling. For an experiment to work, it necessarily needs random sampling. Random assignment is exactly what it sounds like, a form of assigning cases to different conditions in a random way. Regarding the job application study, you may be thinking that we cannot randomly assign race. That's correct. In this study, the applicants weren't the cases. The businesses to which they were applying were the cases. So, to be a true experiment, those businesses had to be randomly assigned to who would apply, either the white or black applicant, and either the clean record or the non-clean record, or the drug conviction record. The reason random assignment is so important for us to infer causality is because individual characteristics or other factors that may influence the outcome of the experiment are thought to be randomly distributed throughout each condition. So in the hiring study, for example, things like potential employers having a bad day or not hiring people would be randomly distributed throughout all the conditions and not necessarily just affect one of those conditions. Now that we know the criteria for an experimental study to infer causation, let's talk about various experimental designs. Whichever book you are using may discuss a couple experimental designs, including a pre-test, post-test design, and factorial designs. These are only a couple of designs, however. In experimental studies, there are many more variations. However, the main components are when the measurement and intervention components take place. The measurement is when you're measuring the phenomenon of interest. The intervention is when you manipulate the environment in some way. So for our hiring bias study, the intervention was when either a black male or white male applied for a job. The measurement was when the company called the person back or not. For experimental studies, we can have multiple groups, multiple interventions, and multiple measurements. It's up to the researcher to identify the most appropriate design for their study. Although specific designs may vary, there are only two contexts in which experiments take place: the laboratory or lab and the field. Lab experiments are those done in a controlled environment, usually on a college campus, to sterilize any other external effects. This environment is one of the strongest for understanding causality between two variables, because all other factors are ruled out, or they're controlled out. Field experiments are those conducted in the real world, such as Dr. Pager's hiring bias study. Given random assignment and a strong design, field experiments also identify causality. In addition, because these studies are conducted in the natural environment, the results most closely mirror what would actually happen in the real context. Finally, let's move on to the process of conducting an experiment. There are 7 steps to this process. First, we must conduct a pre-test or mock test. The phase of the experiment tests out all procedures of the study on a smaller group of people, usually project staff or a very small convenience sample, to make sure everything works as planned. Second, we need to recruit participants, usually for a lab type of experiment, or identify our sampling frame, usually for a field experiment. Third, participants are introduced to the study. This is informing participants about the study and what they will be doing in the study. Fourth, we randomly assign participants to experimental groups. Some will receive the intervention and others may not. Again, this is the most important phase of experimental research. Fifth, we should conduct a manipulation check. After some participants complete the intervention portion of the study, researchers should talk to a few of them on the side to discuss whether they interpreted the intervention as intended. Sixth, researchers should measure the dependent variable. In our hiring bias study, this would be identifying whether companies called back the applicants or not. But this can take several other forms, such as a survey or other measurement methods. And finally, we should debrief with participants and let them know what the study was about. In our hiring bias study, that would be going back to those businesses and just letting them know that they were part of a research study. Many of these processes are specific to the lab experiment and not the field study, since participants in some field studies are not aware of their participation, again, as with our hiring bias study. Well, that's what we have for this discussion of experimental designs. By now you should be familiar with what experiments are, the logic of experimentation, some basic experimental designs, and the process of conducting experiments. Thank you for watching. I'm Dr. Charlie Collins, and I'll see you next time.